And welcome back to my YouTube video. So in this video, we are going to continue with our backend, right? Our job board backend application using Express.js. So in this video, we are going to be using Docker to containerize our Express.js application, right? So I'm not going to go into detail of what Docker is. I have an upcoming Docker crash course that you can use to gain like depth analysis on what you can use to gain deep understanding on Docker, right? So I'm just going to touch on a few concepts. So what is a container when it comes to Docker? So a container is just an isolated process for each of your application's component, right? So think of it like this way: each of our applications component. So in our application, our Express.js application, our job backend application, we have an Express.js application, right, that uses Node.js as our runtime, right? And then it also has another component that it uses MongoDB, right? So what basically Docker is a process for each of our apps containers, right? For example, we have the components for our application is an Express.js application and also a MongoDB application, right? So that means that it runs in its own isolated environment. So that means that it is completely isolated from on our machine, right? And then with a container, we have also what we call an image, right? So a container image is a standardized package that includes all files, binaries, libraries, and configurations to run a container, right? Think of it this way. So we have a container for our Express.js application. So our image is going to be a Node.js, let's say Node.js 19, right? So our container requires Node.js application, Node.js image to run our Express.js application. So basically an image is just a blueprint for our container, right? So that's what an image is, right? And then we have what you call a volume. So what a volume is just a mechanism for persisting and sharing data, right? And then one thing about volumes is that they are stored outside of our container on the host machine. So if you have like a Windows machine or a Mac, they are stored outside of the container. So basically, why are they stored outside the container? They're stored outside the container so that data isn't lost when the container is deleted or recreated, right? So basically, the use for a container is for storing databases, for example, PostgreSQL, sharing files between containers, and then persisting configuration or uploaded content, right? So that's what we use a container for. So now that we understand what's a container, an image, and a volume, so now let's Dockerize our Express.js application. So if you remember, we have our Express.js application, our job board application, right? So in this application, you can see that this is the application that we created. So in this application, we have two components. So we have the Express.js application, and it also depends on our MongoDB, right? Because we are using MongoDB as our backend, right? So inside the root folder of our project, right, we need to create a Dockerfile, right? So just call it a Dockerfile, right? We need to create a Dockerfile, right? This Dockerfile right here, right? So from our Dockerfile, what we are just going to do is let's create let's type in some commands, right? So we are going to say from node, right? From node, as you can see, it's giving us the node. We want version 19. That's the version that we are going to use, right? So what basically this is telling us is that we are going to use Node.js 19 as our base image for our container, right? For our Express.js application container, right? And then the next thing that we need to do is we need to set up a working directory, right? We need to set up a working directory for our container, right? So the working directory for our container is going to be the app, right? So that means that every image is going to be run inside this app folder, inside our container, right? And then what the next thing that we are going to do after this is we are just going to copy the package JSON, right? So we are going to copy the package JSON, right? We are just going to copy this package.json, right? Package.json package.json or package log.json, right? We are just going to copy it, and then we are simply going to copy it inside our app directory, right? We are simply going to copy it inside our app directory right there, right? And then the next command that we are going to type is the command that to tell our container to run npm install. As you can see, right, this command is telling our container to run npm install, right? And then the next thing that we are just going to do is we are just going to copy right? We are simply going to copy the rest of our source code, right? So we are going to copy the rest of our source code. That means we are just going to copy config, controller, middleware, model, route, uploads, right? We are simply just going to copy them inside what? Inside our app directory right there that we created inside our what? Inside our container, right? And then the next thing is what we are simply going to do is we are going to expose our Express.js application to port 6013, right, on our machine. So we are simply going to expose our Express.js application inside our container. We're exposing it on port 6013, right? And then now we are just going to give the commands for our container to run, right? So this command cmd, we want to run npm, right? We want to run npm and then the start command, right? The start command, right? So now that we are done with this, we have successfully created our container, right? So this container uses Node.js Node 19 as our base image, right? You can go onto Docker Hub and you can try to find another version of Node, but in this video I'm just going to use Node 19. After that, we are simply going to set the working directory inside our container. So the working directory is going to be the app, and then we are going to copy the package.json and package log or any package, right, inside our app folder right there. And then we are going to run npm install. So that means that this will generate node modules, right? And then what we are simply going to do is we are simply going to copy our source code inside the app directory. So we are simply going to copy all these files inside our app directory. And then we are simply going to expose our container to port 6013, right? And then we are going to run these commands npm and start, right? So as you can see, now we have this container, right? Our Express.js container, right? But as you can see, now we have a problem, right? Think of it this way: this is our one component of our application, right? That means this is our Express.js application. But as you know, our Express.js application also depends on what? It depends on MongoDB, right? It depends on MongoDB. So what is the appropriate way to do it? Are we going to write another Docker file and then we are going to run another container, separate container, right? So we don't do that, because the problem is, like, we end up having like different containers that are running. We will end up having different containers, and then maybe to run your application, you have to first run this Express.js container, and then we have to run another container with MongoDB, and it kind of makes it messy, and also it makes it difficult to deploy our application, right? So what we do is we use what we call the Docker Compose to define multiple containers, or Docker Compose, right, to define multiple containers, right? So what we are just going to do is I'm going to type Docker Compose .yml, or you can use yml, or you can just type YAML, right? Right. So this is the Docker Compose right there. So this is the Docker Compose right there, right? So the first thing that we need to do with Docker Compose is we need to define our version. You can skip it if you want. So I'm just going, the version of Docker Compose is going to be 3.8, right? So it's going to be 3.8, right? And then the next thing is we need to define the services, right? we need to define what? We need to define services, right? And then for our services, what services do we have? We have a backend, right? We have the backend service, right? We have the backend service, and then on this backend service, we have the build, right? We need to run the build command, right? The build command. So what the build does is that it just builds the container from Dockerfile in the current directory, right? So it will build it inside the current directory, right? And then what we also need is we need to give our container a name, right? So the container name is going to be, let's say, jobbot app, right? So this is the name of our container, right? So now what we are simply do, we need to define the ports, right, for our container, right? So the ports for our container, now what we are simply going to do is we are simply going to define, we are going to map. So what we are simply doing here is we are mapping our container. We are mapping our container to our port on our machine 6013, right? The port on our container 6013 to the one on our machine 6013, right? So that's what we are doing. And then we need to provide also the environment, right? The environment that our application is going to run on, right? In this case, the environment that our application is going to run on is going to be Mongo URL. So it's going to be Mongo URL. So if we go inside our .env file, you can see this Mongo URL right here. That's going to be the environment of our for container right there. And then what we simply have to do here is we simply have to paste this value right there. Control V, right? Right. And then now we are simply going to define the volumes. So if you remember, we talked about volumes when we started this video, right? So our volume is simply going to be up, right? And then what we simply have to do, since we have this service, the backend, right? And then we have the environment that it runs on for our database. And then this backend service, right? Or our jobbot app, this jobbot app container, right? It also depends on another container, right? So what does it depend on? It depends on MongoDB. You see, that's how easy it is to use Docker Compose, rather than for us to just run separate container, right? Which is going to be mess, right? So it depends on, and then we need to provide the service name. So the service that it depends on, the service name is going to be MongoDB right there, right? It depends on MongoDB. And then we also need to define restart, right? So restart, and then we are going to restart unless what? Unless stopped. Right? Unless what? Unless it's stopped, right? So now that we have defined our backend right there, which is going to be like our first container right here, jobbot app, we need to define another service that our what? We need to find another service that what our jobbot app depends on. So this service is going to be, we are going to call it MongoDB. So just make sure that this service, the name of this service is similar to this one. Otherwise, you will get some error, right? So this service, it also depends on an image, right? So what's the image of this? The image of this service is Mongo 6. That's the version number. If you go to Docker Hub, you can even get like a latest version, right? So that's the what? MongoDB image, and then the image is going to be Mongo 6, right? Right. And then we are now going to give this service a container name. So the container name is going to be MongoDB. MongoDB, right? And then we also need ports, right, to map it. So the ports, so we are going to map it from 270, 17 to 270, 17. Right. So we are mapping it our MongoDB, our container port, to the one on our machine, right there, right? And then we also need the volumes, right? The volume. We are going to define the volume. Right? So we are going to define it as volumes, and then it's simply going to be data and then db, right? Yes, should we restart it? Yes, we are going to also restart it, unless what? Unless stopped. We are going to restart it unless stopped, right? And then let's define another volume right here. So volumes, and then the volume is going to be Mongo data, right there. So it's going to be Mongo data right there, right? So we're getting an error, property Mongo data is not allowed. So what's causing this error? Service. Okay, wrong intent. Okay, like this, right? So we have defined what we have used Docker Compose here to define our multiple containers. So in this case, we have two containers. We have the job board app container, and then we have the MongoDB container, right? So instead of running our containers separately and then having to sort of like try to connect to them separately, and also it makes it difficult for us to deploy, we use Docker Compose to just define multiple containers, right? So as you can see, we have a service, this backend right here. The first container is the backend, which the container name we named as jobboard app. And then we have port 6013, which we map to our port on our machine 13, right? The environment, we have to define the environment for this, which is the Mongo URL. And then the volumes, and then it depends on another container, which is MongoDB, which we defined here. So that's how we use Docker Compose to run multiple containers, right? So to build this project, right, what you simply have to do is you simply have to type in this command, Docker Compose app build, right? So let's try to run it. As you can see, it's telling us that MongoDB refers to an undefined volume Mongo data. Right, so I think there is an error here. Okay, so it refers to this. We made a typo. This is supposed to be Mongo data, right? Not underscore, but a dash. So now let's run Docker Compose app. As you can see, now we are running Docker Compose, right? So as you can see, now we are done here. It's finished running. So if I open my Docker desktop application, let me just pull it on the screen. You can see on our containers, we have the job search backend right there. That's our container right there. And then you can see we have another container, which is MongoDB. As you can see, this one, it depends on this one. We have MongoDB. Let's go to images. We have the Mongo, and then we have the job search backend, right? These are our two images, and then this is our container, and we also have the volume, right? The volumes, right? So that was it, guys, on Dockerizing our Express.js application. So in the next video, we are going to be deploying our job board backend to AWS, right? Thanks for watching, guys. Cheers.